In the days that followed episode 5 of the X-Men 97 series, there was an avalanche of reviews and reactions and fan theories, and you could argue a few group therapy sessions dealing with how to cope with the traumatic events of what had occurred. And you could tell that many people on social media who perhaps ignored X-Men 97 were thinking to themselves, maybe I should see what all the fuss is about. But this episode had everything that made the X-Men such compelling characters for decades before the advent of the MCU. It had love triangles, it had drama, sharp and often witty dialogue, and tragic event, and of course, a lot of action. And there wasn't any letdown from there, as every episode raised the stakes. But now that the season finale has aired, I can safely say that it capped one of the greatest pieces of content Marvel has ever produced. And that is saying something. Because now, in a post Avengers Endgame world, where Marvel is trying and failing to create compelling reasons for you to care about what they're producing with what's left of the Avengers, I'm now watching the X-Men slowly regain their prominence in Marvel's pecking order. I'm not quite sure why this didn't happen sooner. Because if I'm Marvel, my immediate plans after Avengers Endgame would not have been crafting stories for the C and D list Avengers. Look, don't get me wrong. I can understand that Marvel thought they were playing with house money. They took characters like Iron Man and Captain America and Thor, and they turned them into household names. But that's not because they wanted to. They had to. That's all they had left. So they took a gamble. They bet the house, and they won. But without going too deep into the rabbit hole of Marvel's bankruptcy in the 90s, look, a lot of the film rights to their more valuable IPs were licensed out to other studios, and unfortunately, that included the X-Men. But when I heard that the X-Men were finally getting a movie made, they were going to be on the big screen, I was excited. Look, information didn't flow as freely back then in the 90s, so I didn't have any idea that Fox owned the film rights to the X-Men. So fast forward to 2000, this first film is released. And it wasn't the best movie in the world, but it was a solid start. There were some things that they got right, like showing that the School for the Gifted was actually a school. So you actually saw kids running around who weren't the X-Men. Even the animated series didn't do that. And then the relationship between Xavier and Magneto and their personal and philosophical differences, that played well on screen. But then they also did things like putting Wolverine at front and center. And he really dominated a lot of the screen time in the movies. And they put Rogue in like a Jubilee-like role. And everyone else got a back seat, at least until Halle Berry complained, and then they gave her more of a role. But look, the less said about her performance, the better. But the trilogy overall was just full of ups and downs. And then the last movie, X-Men The Last Stand, tried to tackle the Phoenix Saga, and it failed. And while it was the first time that they tried, it wouldn't be the last time. So they then rebooted the series, and they explored the origins of Xavier and Magneto's friendship and the formation of the X-Men in the 60s. And like the original trilogy, it started off pretty well with X-Men First Class, and then it got a pretty well-received sequel in Days of Future Past. But then it took a nosedive off a cliff with films that were centered around Apocalypse, and then another film that tried to tackle the Phoenix and failed yet again. So here we are. We fast forwarded several years, and you start to hear rumors that they want to bring back the original animated series, and they want to pick up right where they left off in 1997. Look, this was the show that my friends and I would rush home from school every day to watch back in the 90s. So I was excited, but I didn't necessarily have high hopes. And that's not just because it was Disney. There's just a lot of times where a property is rebooted And whether it's a TV show, a movie, or even a video game, it fails to live up to the original. And in many cases, you're left wishing that it wasn't rebooted at all. But with X-Men 97, there is no doubt in my mind that the writers, the animators, the producers, the voice actors, even the people who brought coffee and bagels to the staff meetings were passionate fans of the original animated series and the roughly 6 decades or so of comic book lore. I mean, this is a show that had a clear vision. They left you clues, some subtle, some not so subtle, in every episode, and they paid off in spectacular ways. It was a show that somehow found a way to combine and streamline so many comic book storylines in ways that made sense for the medium. Look, it understood that it didn't have months or years to tell a story, so it omitted or altered several plot points, like Bastion and his origin, or Madeline Pryor and her descent into madness. But it somehow weaved these into an overarching story that kept you on the edge of your seat in suspense with every single episode. It also left you kind of frustrated because you were sitting there oblivious to the fact that 30 minutes have flown by and then the credits start to roll and you're like, damn, it's over already. But this is a series that stands on its own, and it follows up and improves on the original in every way possible, starting with the intro, which thankfully retained the original X-Men theme song, and then showing you the mutants, splicing it with various scenes that updated as the series went on, so you never wanted to skip the intro because you had to pay attention. It served to give you a preview of what was to come, not unlike the opening sequence to Game of Thrones, which updated the locations and the points of interest depending on where the story was moving. And then next up, you got the characters themselves. Look, one of the biggest criticisms of the original animated series was that the characters kind of felt diminished in their roles. You know, whether it was dialogue, kind of their usefulness out in the field, or they just weren't very interesting. But not so here. Not so here. Look, if you took issue with Cyclops' lack of leadership and skill in the field, the first episode puts that to rest. It quickly shows you he's a confident leading man and he uses his powers in some creative ways. Storm, maybe you thought she was underpowered in the original series. Or, God forbid, your introduction to Storm was Halle Berry trying to fight off Toad in the original 2000s X-Men film. But here, oh, she's given her due. And she is presented as a powerful Omega level threat, so much so that you can literally see the fear in the eyes of the Sentinels when she is near. Now, for every character who kind of steps up, there's a few that take a step back. Wolverine, it's a shock to many, but he really doesn't have a whole lot to do in this first season. But that's okay. Look, I don't deny his popularity, but this show is about X-Men as a whole. It gives everyone a chance to shine, and by the end of the season, you find yourself caring about all of the characters, as the spotlight allows you to understand their individual desires and motivations behind their decisions. And even for someone like Wolverine, when he does get a chance to step up towards the end, well, I think everyone would agree, it paid off. Even someone like Jubilee, she's given meaningful character development. She's no longer the new kid on the block. Nobody questions if she should go out on missions anymore. And she gets to mentor Sunspot, a new member on the team. So it's the episode that's centered around Jubilee and Sunspot, episode 4, which a lot of people thought was the low point of the season. I actually thought was a strong episode because it was a great change of pace given the overall tone of the season. But speaking of the tone, look, I'm not sure if anyone could have prepared for how mentally exhausting X-Men 97 leaves you at the end of every episode. This is a show that is made for us. And by us, I mean fans who grew up with the original. Can kids watch this show? Sure. But this is really for us. And like the original, most of the episodes left you with a cliffhanger that would leave you with a lot to think about. But then you would sit there for a second and realize, wait a minute, there were a lot of things that happened in this episode. So many things that you wonder, how in the hell did they fit so much in a roughly 30-minute runtime? This show is no longer the Saturday morning cartoon where the heroes prevail and there's always a right way to solve a problem. No, the X-Men presents more questions than answers at times. It's a family drama and it's an action show. Those first few episodes kind of lulled you to sleep a little bit, not because it was boring, but because they played out kind of like a typical superhero story. But then it quickly switches up and it leads you down this complex road of storytelling that kind of results in personal drama and love triangles and questions on morality and social obligations and how to deal with death. And then all of this is backed up by a musical score that completely grips you and it just leaves you with goosebumps. It just effortlessly brings you into every scene. It builds anticipation and it makes you feel what the characters are going through. And I'm glad that they used the X-Men theme so many times. They remixed it and it gets you so pumped. You're just ready to go out there and fight with them. And trust me, a lot of fights were had because this show did not take any safe roads. Every fight meant something because we eliminated several characters and not just ancillary characters. As the season wore on, you were left with a sense of dread that your favorite character may meet his or her end. And it's extremely rare that an animated series, let alone anything from Disney, could evoke that kind of horror and fear that this show did because the stakes were always so effing high. There were moments where the characters could rest briefly. But then there were moments where you felt the characters could never rest. And somehow you felt the same way. This world of despair and prejudice and hate that the writers built. And it carried far more emotional impact than anything I ever saw in the MCU. Defeat here has consequences. Even small victories are short-lived and they're rarely anything to celebrate. And those victories, they weren't always represented as like the traditional good guy defeats bad guy. No, sometimes a small victory just meant characters like Cyclops getting one step closer to rebuilding his relationship with Jean Grey. Or maybe Rogue's love triangle with Magneto and Gambit helping her to understand what it truly means to be in love. The drama in X-Men 97 is every bit as compelling as the visual splendor of its action scenes. And the dialogue just often left you thinking, how would you react in a similar situation? Because in a show about superheroes with unbelievable power, X-Men 97 reminded us that these characters are just human beings. They struggle with the same day-to-day problems that we all have. Look, much has been said about the lead writer or the showrunner, Bo DeMaio, and his team and how well written every character is on the show. I'm not sure enough can be said about that. The MCU wishes that they could have had this guy and his team behind the scenes because this writing is truly special. Yeah, it can be melodramatic, a little corny at times, but it's also thought-provoking. And there's so many profound statements that are made to speak to what's going on in even our world. They have no issues using mutants and their plight as an allegory for the minority experiences with discrimination and acceptance. Using these real world issues of humans being fearful or being left behind as the motivation for violence and the formation of extremist groups like the Friends of Humanity. But then you also get character development in someone like Roberto, who shows how his treatment or shows how the treatment from his own family can be just as painful and traumatic as facing legions of Prime Sentinels. There's not one episode that didn't have a quote that didn't make you pause and reflect, even if it was just for a second, because like Game of Thrones, this show earns your attention for as much about its dialogue as it does about its action and visuals. And speaking of those visuals, when the first trailer was released, much was said about how it kind of looked cheap. There's a lot of missing frames, and I understood where people were coming from. I thought it looked good, but I could understand the concern. Look, by the end of the season, though, I think all concerns were put to rest. The show could just visually overwhelm you with how much was going on screen. It's kind of what the 10-year-old me dreamed up if the mutants had ever made it to the big screen. But unfortunately, when they did make it to the big screen, let's just say that Bryan Singer, who was the director of the first two films, he's never been great at directing action scenes. But X-Men 97 makes up for all of that, as the characters and their powers are just beautifully showcased. There were so many moments where my jaw just dropped at how well animated the action scenes were, to the point where I really can't imagine it looking any better on the big screen. But I keep using those two words, big screen. And as I mentioned earlier, the X-Men films were kind of a bit of an uneven mess that paled in comparison to what Marvel was eventually able to do with the MCU. But this show here, it exceeds anything Marvel has ever done. And that includes Infinity War and Endgame. Look, I appreciate the accomplishment that is the MCU. 20 plus movies over 11 years. But I appreciate that accomplishment of the greater MCU more so than any individual movie. Because outside of a few exceptions, like say Winter Soldier, I thought the MCU has been full of cookie cutter movies that often undermine themselves by not taking things seriously or constantly trying to set up the next movie and shying away from tackling any real controversy. It was safe, it was straightforward, it was Disney. I had no reaction to seeing everyone get snapped away in Infinity War because I knew they were all coming back. But in X-Men 97, events have consequences. Words are not to be taken lightly. Death is permanent. Well, okay, mostly permanent. At least enough for you to worry that your favorite character might meet a similar fate. But look, I can't deny the impact of the Avengers and the MCU. For a generation of people, they are now the A-listers. But for my generation, hardly anyone cared about them. And if not for the MCU, I don't think anyone still would care about them. But in my generation, X-Men, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, those were the stars of Marvel. And you can call me an old man. I accept that. But the Avengers in the MCU is kind of what I thought the X-Men on the big screen would be. Kind of a series of solo movies leading up to a big event that would require the entire team to get involved to handle it. So it left me kind of bitter to see the Avengers take the spotlight for the last few decades. I'm petty, I'll admit it. I'm glad the Avengers are taking a backseat to the X-Men right now. I don't know how long that will last. But if Marvel keeps producing dog crap, trying to force what's left of the Avengers into the spotlight, hey, maybe the X-Men will get to shine just a little bit longer. Because X-Men 97 is a masterful 10 episodes of a season. And it answers the question, especially for younger viewers. It answers the question of why. Why did these characters have a stranglehold on fans before the MCU came along? Why have they been far more interesting a group of heroes than the Avengers ever were? And people flocked to read their comics over the Avengers. Why have the villains and the stories been more complex, appealing, and captivating than anything from the MCU? I think we just saw that a group of people who were actual fans of the original animated series and comics in general, they just showed you why. It's been really satisfying watching younger viewers react to X-Men 97, and they're slowly beginning to understand what makes this property so special. And it's been great watching older viewers who have read all the comics and they think they know what's going to happen, only for the show to throw them a curveball. I love that. The show has kind of given me a little bit of closure. I no longer care if the X-Men ever make it back to the big screen. Animation has come so far over the years that it kind of took a show like this to remind me that maybe, just maybe, this property benefits from being in animated form. Regardless of what happens, X-Men 97 stands alone as one of my favorite series of all time. And to all of the people who worked on this show, you all need to take a bow for a job well done. And I am looking forward to season 2. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.